Okay, so welcome to this episode of Coffee Talk. I'm Duncan Chappell, managing director at Kia Company, and I'm here with Mike Myers from KPMG. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Duncan. It's a pleasure.
So Michael, we're having these discussions as part of the preparations for the Analyst Relations Forum, and we're reaching out to a number of people like yourself who are really seasoned veterans of the analyst relations community, and we're throwing around questions about people's career paths and about how things seem to be changing and how things are staying the same in the analyst relations um, in the analyst relations world. So obviously, we're going to be talking later on about your career development, but I think it's worth just to give a little bit of context that you've been in the community for what 15, 16 years. Through really large, impressive firms. Household names like Siemens and SAP, and obviously now KPMG. One of those fascinating big four firms that kind of stepped out of the kind of IT services, consulting, outsourcing kind of area, and then came back into it quite dramatically. So I know there's a lot that we're going to be able to talk about with you. But before we move on to the questions, I just want to draw attention to the Twitter handle and mine, since I'm a shameless self publicist. So if people are listening to the call, they can tweet us, or if people have got follow up points, since I know most people are going to be listening to this as a replay rather than attending the call in real time, then feel free to submit their questions, comments, thoughts to us this way. Um, Michael, we reached out to people who'd registered for the call and said, are there particular topics that you'd like us to be mulling over during this coffee talk? So what we're going to try to do, I think, in the next maybe half hour, something like that, is just to kind of quickly go over a few of the topics that people have started off with. And I want to start off with this question: was there was there a point in your career when you kind of realized, right, analyst relations, that's it for me, or did you kind of stumble into analyst relations? How did it happen?
Well, I'd say it was a combination. I did stumble into analyst relations, but you could say it was a logical outgrowth of what I had been doing. So prior to joining analyst relations, the whole first part of my career was in market research, and then product marketing, and then back into market research. So at the time, I was doing some project management for a systems integrator called Entex. And Entex was purchased by what was then called Siemens Business Services. It's now Atos Origin. So after the project that I was working on ended, I was casting about for a new role, and my project manager said, "Why don't you talk to the new head of the new marketing department?" So I spoke to him, and he looked at my resume and said, "Wow, market research and technology. We have an opening in our analyst relations department. Why don't you take that over?" And I said, "Sure, what's analyst relations?" And that's how I got into analyst relations, starting at what was then a small, $500 million subsidiary of the giant Siemens firm. Worked there for about 5 or 6 years. Had a brief stint at a division of AIG, the large insurance company, where I was recruited by former Siemens people. Then an opening came up at SAP, and they said, "Wow, you have AR experience for a German firm in services." It's one of the few times where the round peg fit the round hole. And I was at SAP for a while, followed some senior managers over to HP, which didn't go as well as it could have. And now I'm happy that I landed here at KPMG.
So I think one of the interesting things is that, okay, so firstly, I mean, that's a very impressive resume and lots of amazing brands. Um, But what's interesting is that you've kind of moved from Siemens, where I think many people see Siemens as being a hardware firm, then into SAP, which most people see as a software vendor, and then into KPMG, which most people see as an accounting firm. So very different organizations. But then in each of these, you've been promoting, you know, you know, a software centered solution in Siemens, and then services inside SAP, and obviously now consulting and other solutions inside KPMG. So I suppose the two things that strike me is, well, firstly, what's the difference between doing you know analyst relations for software, for services, for consulting, and then also I suppose what is that different in somehow when it's perhaps not seen as being the core business of the firm, even if it really is.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, and fortunately, the one constant through the four main companies, so we'll call it Siemens, SAP, HP, and now KPMG. It's always been on the services side. So at Siemens Business Services, it was a pure IT services company, pure consulting. And I think our big role back then was help desk outsourcing, if anybody remembers those days. At SAP, I had responsibility for the entire range of services AR. So we had SAP implementation, we had education, certification, and training. We had support and maintenance, which was certainly a challenge at SAP when they decided to unilaterally raise the maintenance rate without consulting their user community. And at HP, I continued on the IT services side. HP had two services organizations. One was Enterprise Services, which was the former EDS, and the other group at the time I joined was called Technology Services. So that was, again, support and maintenance, and it was also implementations around data center and their cloud assessments. So there was a similar thread all throughout. And here at KPMG, very similar. I'm handling analyst relations. So from my perspective, the job really hasn't changed, and I've benefited from long-standing relationships, some up to 10, 12 years with some of the analysts in the community. But from the perspective of working at the company, when you're at a software company such as SAP, you always have to fight for airspace. So it's a matter of working collaboratively with your AR colleagues and making sure that the service message gets integrated appropriately. But then as SAP moves more towards solutions, that becomes an easier task to handle. Similarly at HP, well, HP, while I was there, had its set of challenges, so it's unfair to characterize that as, being difficult from an AR perspective. So we really just focused on our specific silo of analyst relations tasks. And here at KPMG, I've been here for about 2 months, so I'm still getting my feet wet, and it's hard for me to really give you an example of how KPMG is different, only that they're very excited to be in the marketplace.
So, over the course of your career, I mean, how has analyst relations changed? I mean, I'm sure that over this period of time, from the '90s through to today, I mean, the perception of AR has changed, and the behavior of the analyst industry has changed, and the way in which AR is positioned, that's also changed. But I mean, how are you seeing things as being different? I mean, is everything different? Some things more or less the same? What's your feeling?
Well, when I first started out, and this may be typical to my experience, or other folks may have shared the same experience, it was really about how do we get into the upper right-hand quadrant of a Gartner MQ. And that was really all analyst relations was about. How do you get in the upper right-hand quadrant? How do you spend less on these contracts? And internally, how do you get the research to people who don't want to buy seats? So that was really the challenge when I when I first started out. But I think over the years, analyst relations has become a more strategic role, less tactical. There's always tactical sides to it, but I think analyst relations, especially at some of the larger firms, has a seat at the table in terms of new product or service development, mergers and acquisitions, new strategic direction, and it's exciting to be part of that process. So you're brought in early, you find out what's going on, you get to determine which analysts you're going to bring in as trusted advisors, and in many cases, you get to shape the entire strategy of the product launch. So I think we've gone from a purely tactical, inquiry magic quadrant placement to a strategic, trusted advisor within the organization.
And a lot of your experience is in larger
Now,
organizations.
you also you.
Oh, sorry. Please carry on. Carry on.
I'm sorry. What was it?
Oh, no, no, no.
Yeah,
Carry on.
sure. Sure. One of the other things I think that has changed is the analyst landscape. So when I first started out, it was Gartner. Well, it still is to some extent, but it was Gartner, Forrester, IDC. I think Giga was around, AMR was around. So maybe you had the big five. And then there were various niche firms, boutique firms, tier two firms that would specialize in a specific area that you, as an AR practitioner, may be interested in. Then we saw a lot of consolidation. Forrester absorbed Giga, Gartner absorbed AMR. And then you saw the emergence of a new breed of analyst firms, such as Constellation Research with our buddy Ray Wang, or Horses for Sources with Phil First. And I think they are challenging the existing model of the analyst landscape. I think the jury is still out as to whether that's going to be successful or not. But I know specifically each of those firms has something to offer that is of interest to a more narrow focus. Phil and Horses for Sources really focuses on the BPO area, and I think he goes very deeper than some of the traditional big three can. So the challenge there is managing multiple relationships and figuring out where you need to spend your resources and your time. So
Right.
that's one of the other changes I've seen.
I think that's a good point. I think something that's very surprising if you look at firms like HFS Research and Constellation is how quickly these organizations have gone from starting up to being, serious mid-tier players in the analyst industry. I mean, that's it was so much harder to start firms up
Well,
10 years
I
ago.
think the advantage that they had was both Phil and Ray were established analysts. So they had established followings and they had an established reputation in their specific areas of expertise. So it's easier for them to start up something built around that core area. And I think they also have different models as opposed to the strong subscription models that Gartner has, and slightly less strong subscription models that Forrester and IDC have. I've always found it easier to work with Forrester and IDC than with Gartner, but maybe that's a personal set of experiences. So I think that's how Phil and Ray have been able to succeed, and they've also been able to attract talent that are leaving the established analyst firms. I think Ray's bench strength, Phil's bench strength. You look at the roster of analysts they have. There's some names that would be the go-to analysts back in the days of the big five that I mentioned at the start of this part of the conversation.
So, so much of your experience has been in relatively large organizations. I mean, not just large ones, but also some of the ones which are absolutely at the leading edge of analyst relations. How do you think large companies should be leveraging analyst relations to gain the most business value? I mean, do you think all large firms are are doing it really well, or is there still something that the large firms are not doing effectively?
Yeah, I think it all depends on where the analyst relations department sits in the organization and how they're measured. So in some organizations, analyst relations sits in a communications organization. So they're driven by the goals of the communications organization, and sometimes those tend to be more transactional in nature. They borrow a lot from the world of public relations. Um, in other cases, analyst relations sits in a marketing organization, so the goals of the marketing department then become what drives analyst relations. And I think that's a better fit for developing business value because obviously marketing wants to develop new business and use analyst relations as an adjunct for that. And then in yet some other firms, analyst relations sits in a strategy department. And I think that's really the best fit for analyst relations because that's the way you can leverage the greatest amount of business value, uh, at least in terms of developing new strategy, and as I referenced earlier, mergers and acquisitions and things like that. So again, part of it is determined by where in the organization AR sits, and then how it's measured.
So, obviously, in your career, you must have worked with many executives who had very different levels of understanding of analyst relations and commitment to analyst relations. And you must have encountered some who were quite skeptical about the value of analyst relations. So, what approaches have you found to be most useful when proving the value of analyst relations to executives?
Well, I think the number one area of proof is when you get a positive mention in an analyst report. I mean, that always pleases an executive, although you can't go in when you're trying to convince a skeptical executive and promise that sort of thing. So I think you have, with those who are skeptical, I think you have to do a little bit of AR 101 and show the long-term results of establishing, building, and maintaining relationships with the analysts. And wherever possible, give successful examples from within your own organization. They don't want to hear what happened at a previous organization. So you have to work and try to establish some level of trust. And in many cases, you can do that with some quick wins, whether it's an inquiry around a specific sticky tactical situation that you have, or maybe there's a consulting session that you can put together to solve a strategic problem. So those are ways of getting quick wins and gaining trust of those skeptical executives. For the seasoned executives and those who understand the value of analyst relations, I think what you want to do is leverage them as much as possible. So you want to make sure that you have them in front of the analysts as frequently as their schedules allow, usually quarterly, although if it's really an emerging area within the organization, you may want to consider monthly. But again, time is always a constraint. And you want to make sure that those are the executives that you have speaking at your analyst events, if you do hold one of those. So I think that's how you focus on those two different types of executives, the skeptics and those who understand the value of analyst relations.
So, limited time is definitely a big constraint for AR people. Um, is that the biggest challenge in the activities of an analyst relations professional today, or what do you think is the biggest challenge?
Well, I came up with this um, equation that I call the OIC equation. And O stands for outcomes, I stands for interactions, and C stands for constraints. So outcomes equal interactions divided by constraints. So your constraints are a variety of things. Of course, they're the time of the spokespeople. but there are also the time of the marketing people or the content development people to make sure that your briefing decks are developed in time. There's the time of your subject matter experts to respond to submissions for Magic Quadrants, waves, and marketscapes. And then there's always budget constraints. How much are you going to spend on analyst subscriptions? How much are you going to spend at events, both sponsored by the analyst firm and events that you may put on? So time is the key thing, and then of course budget. So you're always trying to figure out how to weave through that minefield of constraints. And I think everybody has to develop a strategy that works for them within their own organization. What worked at Siemens may not work at SAP, may not work at HP, and may not work at KPMG. But you just pick the best practices, I guess, using an AR term. Use the best practices and try to figure out how to navigate that.
So, looking back at how it was when you became an analyst relations professional, what advice would you give somebody coming into the analyst relations profession right now?
Well, so I don't know whether I would have benefited from advice when I joined the analyst relations world. It just seemed to be a logical outgrowth of my marketing and market research background. I think that people who are joining AR, in some cases, many people starting out, they may have come from a communications background, either directly out of college or from a previous job at a PR firm or something similar. I think the key thing is to develop relationships with your key analysts, but also to take advantage of organizations like the AR Forum and get to know your peers and understand what their career paths were and what has benefited them. But also in every AR organization, there's always one person who you can look to as a mentor that understands, maybe has a similar background to you, maybe came up the same way, and is willing to share her or his experience. And then also look at AR in terms of your long-term career goals. Is this something that you want to stay in? Are you attracted to what analyst relations is, which is basically, I always say there's two parts of analyst relations, the analyst part and the relationship part, and I enjoy both sides equally. Some folks really enjoy reading the research, becoming close to a subject matter expert, and growing with the company, and developing and maintaining those strong relationships. And other people just see this as part of a larger communications role, and they spend their time in analyst relations before moving to PR or media relations or blogger relations or social media, and try to develop a more rounded communications portfolio. So I think what you have to look at it from those two perspectives. Do you want to be an AR specialist or a communications generalist? And figure it out from there.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Mike, I've got one last question for you. It's a bit of a hard one, but I mean, looking at yourself, as an analyst relations professional right now, and then thinking back to when you first started working, with Siemens, what's the biggest difference?
Well, I think there's a few differences. I'll touch on three differences. I think we already talked about the emergence of new analyst firms. So that's one area that's different. It used to be pretty monolithic, and now it's somewhat fragmented. I wouldn't say it's totally fragmented, but there are a lot of firms out there, and it's important for you to choose the analyst firm and the analysts that will work with your company and will benefit you. I think we have a much stronger understanding of economic cycles than we did when I first started. I mean, we had the impact of 9/11, and we had the impact of the economic turndown of 2008. So, having lived through that, I'm always looking to make sure that long term we can, an analyst relations program can, you ride the waves of any economic upheaval. And then the third area is the emergence of new tools, and specifically social media. I've leveraged social media while I was at SAP. I developed two Twitter channels that are still in use there, one for SAP services and another one directly for SAP analyst relations. And engage with analysts on Twitter quite regularly. And, fielding questions as a result of this coffee talk on Twitter. So social media tools definitely have become a new tool in the arsenal of things that we use to effectively execute analyst relations.
That's fantastic. So, Mike, our half hour is up. I just want to finish up by reminding people, firstly, of your Twitter handle, m_Myers, and then also of the address for our LinkedIn group. So, if people do have questions about what we've been talking about in this coffee talk or anything else about analyst relations, really we encourage people to come along to LinkedIn, join the analyst relations forum there, and to get involved in the discussion in LinkedIn, and then also, of course, to come along to the Analyst Relations Forum in September. Mike, thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion with you in the LinkedIn group and of course, at the forum itself in September.
Duncan, it was a pleasure, and I look forward to it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.